when Margaret Whitmore's prize dairy cow refused to enter the barn for 3 straight days. Everyone told her she was overreacting. They said she was paranoid, that she was losing her mind over nothing. But when she finally climbed into that loft and saw what was hiding there, the entire town of Millbrook would never look at her the same way again. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning mist rolled across the Vermont hills like a living thing, clinging to the valleys and wrapping itself around the old maple trees that lined the property. Margaret Whitmore stood on her porch, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee, so strong it could wake the dead. It was the first week of October, and the air had that peculiar quality of autumn in New England, crisp enough to make your lungs ache, sweet with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. She had been running Whitmore Farm alone for nearly 15 years, ever since her husband David had passed suddenly from a heart attack that no one saw coming. The farm wasn't large by commercial standards, just 65 acres tucked into the rolling countryside outside Millbrook, Vermont, but it was hers. Every fence post, every row of hay, every one of her 14 dairy cows represented hours of backbreaking work and stubborn determination. At 52 years old, Margaret had calluses on her hands that told stories of early mornings and late nights, of storms weathered and seasons endured. The locals respected her, mostly. A widow farmer was still something of a curiosity in Millbrook, a town where tradition ran as deep as the roots of the sugar maples. But she had proven herself capable, year after year, delivering quality milk to the local cooperative and keeping her operation running smoothly despite the odds. She didn't ask for help, didn't complain, and didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. That Tuesday morning started like 1,000 others before it. Margaret drained her coffee, set the mug on the porch rail, and pulled on her worn work gloves. The barn stood about 50 yards from the farmhouse, a classic New England dairy barn painted red with white trim, its gambrel roof showing its age but still solid. Her grandfather had built it in 1952, and though she'd had to replace boards and patch the roof over the years, the structure remained sound. She walked across the dewy grass toward the barn, her boots leaving dark trails in the silver moisture. Her cows were already gathering near the gate, as they did every morning, their breath creating small clouds in the cool air. She knew each one by name, by temperament, by the particular way they moved. And that's why she noticed immediately when something was wrong. Clementine, her best producer and most reliable cow, stood at the threshold of the barn doors, but she wasn't entering. The Holstein's distinctive coloring, mostly black with a white blaze down her face and white stockings on her rear legs, made her easy to spot in any crowd. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Margaret's attention. It was her behavior. The cow's ears were pinned back flat against her head. Her nostrils flared wide, sucking in air in rapid, shallow breaths. Her large brown eyes showed white around the edges, and her entire body was rigid, muscles tense beneath her hide. Most telling of all, her hooves were planted firmly in the mud outside the barn, and she refused to cross the threshold. "Come on, Clem," Margaret said, her voice calm and even. She'd learned long ago that animals responded to tone more than words. "Breakfast time, girl. Let's go." She reached out to guide Clementine by her halter, applying gentle pressure. But the moment she tried to lead the cow forward, Clementine jerked her massive head back with surprising force, nearly yanking Margaret off her feet. A low, distressed moo rumbled from deep in the cow's chest, not the usual sound of greeting or mild complaint, but something else entirely, something that sounded almost like fear. The other cows filed past without issue, mooing contentedly as they made their way to their familiar stalls. Bessie, Daisy, Marigold, Buttercup, all of them walked through those barn doors as they had every morning for years. But Clementine remained frozen at the entrance, trembling now, her eyes fixed on something inside that Margaret couldn't see. Margaret felt a prickle of unease run down her spine. She'd been around cattle her entire life. She knew their moods, their quirks, their behaviors. And this wasn't normal. This wasn't a cow being stubborn or having a bad day. This was genuine terror. She spent 20 minutes trying to coax Clementine inside, using every trick she knew. She offered grain from a bucket, tried leading from different angles, even walked through the barn herself multiple times to show there was nothing to fear. Nothing worked. Finally, frustrated and running behind schedule, She gave up and led Clementine to the side paddock instead, where at least the cow could graze in peace. Fine, Margaret muttered, latching the paddock gate. Have it your way, but you're going back in there tomorrow. Except tomorrow came, and Clementine still wouldn't enter. Wednesday morning, same scene. The cow approached the barn with the other animals, but the moment she reached those open doors, she stopped dead. Her breathing quickened, her body went rigid, and no amount of coaxing or pulling could convince her to take another step forward. Margaret even tried approaching from behind, thinking she could gently encourage the cow through, but Clementine simply backed up, nearly trampling Margaret's feet in her desperation to get away from the entrance. The other cows showed no such hesitation. They walked past Clementine as if she were invisible, disappearing into the barn's shadowy interior without a care in the world. Whatever Clementine sensed, she was apparently sensing it alone. By Thursday morning, Margaret was genuinely worried. She checked Clementine from nose to tail, looking for any sign of injury or illness that might explain the behavior. The cow's hooves were fine, no cracks, no infections. Her eyes were clear, her nose wet and healthy. Her temperature was normal, her appetite excellent. By every measurable standard, Clementine was in perfect health. She just absolutely, categorically refused to enter the barn. Margaret stood in her kitchen that afternoon, staring out the window at the barn while she drank her third cup of coffee. Her daughter Emily called just as the sun was starting to sink toward the western hills. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. How are things?" "Fine," Margaret said automatically, then paused. "Actually, something weird is happening." She explained the situation with Clementine, 3 days now of refusing to enter the barn, the obvious fear, the inability to find any logical explanation. Emily was quiet for a moment. "Have you called the vet?" "For what?" "The cow isn't sick, Em. She's scared." "Scared of what?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." "Mom." Emily's tone shifted to that particular frequency that adult children use when they're about to offer unwanted advice. "Maybe you're reading too much into this. Cows are prey animals. They get spooked by weird things. Remember when Dad's old gelding wouldn't go past that mailbox for a whole summer because it had a new flag on it? This is different." "How?" Margaret struggled to put it into words. "The look in her eyes, Em. It's not just being startled. She's terrified of something in that barn." "Well, have you looked for what might be scaring her? Could be a raccoon living in there. Or maybe there's a smell she doesn't like. I've walked through that barn 10 times. There's nothing there." Emily sighed. "Then maybe she's just being weird. Give it a few more days. She'll get over it." But Margaret wasn't convinced. After hanging up, she grabbed a flashlight and walked back to the barn, even though it was nearing dusk. She went through every stall again, checked the feed room, examined the walls for any signs of damage or intrusion. She even climbed up the first few rungs of the ladder that led to the hay loft, though her knees complained about the effort, and shined her light around the dusty space above. Nothing. Just bales of hay, old equipment, and cobwebs. Friday morning at the Millbrook Feed and Grain, Margaret made the mistake of mentioning the problem to Walter Henshaw, who'd been running the store since before Margaret was born. She was picking up a salt lick and some supplements, making small talk while Walter rang up her order. "Strangest thing," she said, almost to herself. "My best cow won't go in the barn. For days now. Acts like the place is haunted." Walter's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Won't go in the barn? What do you mean?" "Just what I said. Stops right at the doors, won't take another step. The other cows are fine, but Clementine acts absolutely terrified." Walter's mouth twitched. Then he started to chuckle. "Margaret, you telling me your cow is afraid of your barn? I know it sounds strange, but..." "Sounds strange? It sounds ridiculous." Walter was fully laughing now, his considerable belly shaking. "In all my years, I've heard of cows being stubborn, cows being stupid, but scared of a barn? That's a new one." 2 other customers, Bill Patterson and his son, turned at the commotion. "What's so funny?" Bill asked. "Margaret here says her cow won't enter her barn," Walter announced, still grinning. "Says the animal's scared of it." Bill's face split into a wide smile. "Scared? Of what ghost?" He nudged his son. "Better call those paranormal investigators, Get them to do an episode on the haunted barn of Millbrook." The feed store erupted in laughter. Margaret felt her face grow hot, but she kept her composure. "I'm just saying something's wrong. The cow's behavior isn't normal." "Course it's not normal," Walter said, wiping his eyes. Normal cows go in barns. You got yourself a special cow there, Margaret. Maybe she's too good for regular accommodations. Maybe she wants a penthouse suite. More laughter followed her out to her truck. As she loaded the supplies into the bed, she could hear them still chuckling inside, no doubt already planning how they'd spread this story around town. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she drove home. She wasn't an overly sensitive woman, but the mockery stung more than she wanted to admit. By Sunday, the story had made its way through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. At church, Margaret noticed the whispers and the poorly concealed smiles. After the service, Janet Morehouse, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary and champion busybody, cornered Margaret by the coffee urn. "Margaret, dear, I heard about your situation with your livestock." Janet's smile was syrupy sweet and about as genuine as a $3 bill. "Have you considered that perhaps farming alone is becoming too challenging? At our age, we sometimes need to admit when things are getting to be too much." Margaret's jaw tightened. "The farm is fine, Janet. And I'm 52, not 90. Of course. I just mean that stress can make us see problems that aren't really there. My Harold always says women can be a bit more emotional about their animals." "Emotional?" Margaret repeated flatly. "Well, yes. Men tend to be more practical about livestock. It's just biology, dear. No shame in it." Janet patted Margaret's arm condescendingly. "Perhaps you should talk to Reverend Paul. He offers wonderful counseling services." Margaret excused herself before she said something she'd regret in the Lord's house. But as she drove home, Janet's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the laughter from the feed store, with Emily's gentle dismissal, with the way people were now looking at her, like she was becoming a batty old widow who'd lost touch with reality. Monday brought her neighbor, Frank Douglas, who farmed the property adjacent to hers. He rode over on his ATV, ostensibly to return a borrowed wrench, but really to satisfy his curiosity. "Heard you're having some trouble with one of your cows," he said, leaning against his vehicle with studied casualness. "Word travels fast. It's a small town, Margaret. People talk." He paused. "Wanting to take a look? Sometimes animals respond better to a man's handling." The implication was clear, and it made Margaret's blood pressure rise. "I've been handling animals for 40 years, Frank. I think I can manage. No offense intended. Just offering to help. Though I gotta say, a cow being scared of a barn, that's pretty unusual. You sure there's not something else going on? Maybe the animal's just being ornery and you're, I don't know, overthinking it." "She's terrified, Frank. Not ornery. There's a difference." Frank shrugged. "If you say so. Though between you and me, I think you might be projecting. Cows don't have complex emotions like that. They're livestock, not pets. I know what I'm seeing." Sure. But his tone said otherwise. As he rode away, Margaret could practically see him rehearsing how he'd tell this story to the boys at the Grange Hall. That evening, Margaret's son called. Emily had clearly been talking to him. "Mom, Em says you're getting worked up about one of the cows. You doing okay?" "I'm fine, Jason. The cow's the one with the problem, right? The cow that won't go in the barn." He tried to keep his voice neutral, but she could hear the skepticism. "Have you thought about maybe, I don't know, taking a break? When's the last time you had a real vacation?" "I don't need a vacation. I need people to stop treating me like I'm crazy." "Nobody thinks you're crazy, Mom. We're just worried. You've been under a lot of stress, running that place by yourself. Maybe you're looking for problems that aren't there." Margaret closed her eyes and counted to 10. "Jason, listen to me. Something is wrong. I don't know what it is yet, but Clementine knows. Animals sense things we don't." "Mom, that's kind of superstitious thinking, don't you think?" "It's not superstition. It's experience. I've been farming my whole life. I know. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay? Don't let this thing become an obsession." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen as darkness fell outside. The barn was visible through the window, its silhouette black against the deepening blue of twilight. Clementine stood in her paddock, and even from this distance, Margaret could see that the cow was facing the barn, watching it. The mockery from town, the concern from her children, the thinly veiled suggestions that she was losing her grip, all of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. It would be easy to give in, to accept their explanations, to write off Clementine's behavior as just one of those inexplicable things that sometimes happen with animals. But Margaret Whitmore hadn't survived 15 years of running a farm alone by taking the easy path. She hadn't kept her land and her independence by listening to people who thought they knew better. And she sure as hell wasn't going to start doubting her own observations now, no matter how many people in Millbrook thought she was being a foolish, emotional woman. Something was in that barn. Something that had Clementine terrified. And Margaret was going to find out what it was, even if the whole town thought she'd lost her mind. She stood up, pulled on her jacket, and grabbed her flashlight. The barn waited in the darkness, keeping its secrets. But not for much longer. As she crossed the yard toward those red doors, Clementine let out a low, mournful moo from her paddock, a sound that sent chills racing down Margaret's spine. Whatever was waiting in that loft, it was time to face it. The week that followed felt like walking through fog, everything familiar yet somehow distorted. Margaret continued her daily routines with mechanical precision, but the weight of the town's judgment followed her everywhere. At the post office, conversations stopped when she entered. At the grocery store, she caught sympathetic looks from some women and amused smirks from others. The story of Margaret's haunted barn had become Millbrook's favorite piece of entertainment. Each morning brought the same ritual. The cows would gather at the barn entrance, and each morning Clementine would approach, stop at the threshold, and refuse to enter. The terror in the animals' eyes never diminished. If anything, it seemed to intensify. By the end of the second week, Clementine wouldn't even approach within 10 feet of the barn doors. She'd stop well short, plant her hooves, and bellow, a sound Margaret had never heard from her in all the years she'd owned the cow. Margaret spent her evenings walking through the barn with increasingly desperate thoroughness. She examined every board, every nail, every shadow. She checked for gas leaks, strange odors, structural damage, anything that might explain what was frightening her most reliable animal. She brought in a carpenter friend who owed her a favor, and he walked through the entire structure, tapping walls and checking beams. Solid as the day it was built, he'd pronounced. Whatever's bothering your cow, it ain't the barn falling down. She hired an exterminator to check for pest infestations. He found evidence of mice. What barn didn't have mice? But nothing unusual, nothing that would cause the extreme reaction she was witnessing. "Ma'am, I've been doing this 20 years, he said, packing up his equipment. "There's nothing in this barn that would spook livestock. Honestly, I think your cow's just being weird." The isolation began to wear on her. Margaret had always been independent, even proud of her ability to stand alone, but this was different. This wasn't choosing solitude. This was being pushed to the margins by people who decided she was either incompetent or unbalanced. Former friends now spoke to her with the cautious tone people use around the fragile. Neighbors who'd once sought her advice now offered their own with patronizing smiles. At the monthly Grange meeting, she sat alone while clusters of farmers gathered in other corners, their conversations punctuated with glances in her direction. Pete Morrison, who'd farmed his whole life and considered himself the voice of rural wisdom, finally approached her during the coffee break. "Margaret, can I speak frankly?" He didn't wait for permission. "People are worried about you. This thing with the cow, it's gone on too long. You're making yourself look foolish, and it's affecting how people see your operation. If you can't handle one difficult animal, how can you handle a whole herd?" "The animal isn't being difficult, Pete. She's genuinely frightened." "Of what?" "You've had every expert in the county look at that barn. There's nothing there. At some point, you have to accept that maybe you're wrong." "I know what I'm seeing." Pete's expression shifted from concern to frustration. "No, what you're doing is letting one cow's strange behavior turn into some kind of obsession. It's making you look unstable. And in this business, reputation matters. If buyers start thinking you're not right in the head, it'll affect your contracts." The threat was veiled but clear. Margaret felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "My contracts are based on the quality of my milk, which has never suffered. What Clementine does or doesn't do has no bearing on my ability to run this farm. Maybe not. But perception matters, Margaret. And right now, people perceive you as a woman who's in over her head, seeing problems that don't exist." He softened his tone slightly. "Look, I know it's been hard since David passed. Nobody doubts you've worked hard. But maybe it's time to consider selling. There's no shame in it. You've had a good run." Margaret stood up, her coffee forgotten. "I'm not selling, Pete. And I'm not crazy. Something is wrong in that barn, and I'm going to figure out what it is." She left the meeting early, driving home through darkness that seemed heavier than usual. The town's message was clear: conform or be cast out. Accept their explanation or be labeled unstable. Stop making waves or face the consequences. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Clementine's behavior had started. Margaret was in town picking up supplies when she overheard a conversation at the hardware store. She'd been comparing prices on fence wire when two voices drifted from the next aisle over. Heard she's talking about calling in some kind of animal psychic now. That was Tommy Wexler, a young farmer who'd inherited his father's land and attitude. You're joking. The second voice belonged to Craig Donovan. An animal psychic? For a cow. I'm serious. My mom heard it from Janet Morehouse. Said Margaret's getting desperate, talking about how the cow is sensing something supernatural. Margaret's hands tightened on the fence wire. She'd said no such thing. That's just sad, Craig replied. Woman's clearly losing it. Running a farm alone probably finally broke her. My dad always said women don't have the constitution for this work long term. The laughter that followed was casual, careless. Margaret stood frozen, shame and fury warring inside her. She quietly set down the fence wire and left the store, abandoning her half-filled cart. She sat in her truck for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. The rumors had grown beyond her control. She'd become a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when women tried to do men's work, when widows didn't know when to quit. That evening, as the sun painted the Vermont hills in shades of gold and amber, Margaret stood in her barnyard staring at the structure that had become the center of her unraveling. Clementine watched from her paddock, that same fixed stare directed at the barn doors. Margaret had spent 15 years proving herself in a world that expected her to fail. She'd survived droughts, equipment breakdowns, and brutal winters, all without asking for help. She hadn't come this far by doubting herself every time someone else doubted her. She knew the truth. Something was terribly wrong in that barn, and she was going to find it, regardless of what Millbrook thought of her. As darkness settled, she noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. The other cows, when they came out of the barn in the evenings, gave the loft area a wide berth. They'd walk along the far side of their exit path, never directly under where the loft door hung. The loft. She'd climbed up there briefly, shined a light around, seen nothing unusual, but she hadn't really searched it thoroughly. Maybe that had been a mistake. Margaret went into the house and returned with her heavy-duty flashlight, changed into sturdy work clothes, and headed back outside. The barn loomed in the twilight, innocent and familiar. So why did approaching it now make her heart race? She pushed open the doors. Everything normal. Everything safe. The ladder to the loft stood against the far wall. Margaret approached it and began to climb. Each rung brought protest from her knees, but she pushed through. The loft floor came level with her eyes, and she paused, shining her flashlight into the darkness above. Hay bales, old equipment. Nothing seemed out of place, but something made her hesitate, a smell underneath the familiar barn scents. Something faint but wrong, something organic and out of place. Every instinct screamed at her to climb back down, to wait for daylight. But who would come? Who would believe her? No one. So Margaret Whitmore climbed the last 3 rungs into the loft that would change everything.